First of all, my apologies for the fact that the paper that's in the main booklet had to be written before much of the wheat was harvested. So this presentation is considerably different to what you've actually got in your books. And I should also point out that this is part of a new project from GRDC that's led by Birchip Cropping Group. And basically it's about extending the results from the MVT trials and to try and make more use of them. And so I'm going to dovetail MVT results with some of the observations from over the year. There are two people involved, and this particular project's led by Simon Craig, and he handles the lower rainfall, so you'll be hearing from him tomorrow, and I'm doing the high rainfall zone today. It has actually been suggested that it's Tweedledum and Tweedledee, and I just really want to emphasise that Simon's the former. Okay. Take-home messages. Top wheat performers following a late break were Beaufort, Revenue and Preston. In terms of milling, Scout, Derrimut and Bolac, and probably the one of the newcomers that there's a reasonable amount of talk about would be Trojan, an APW wheat. Feed advantage over milling, and I'm going to go into this in some detail, looks to be around that 12 to 15%, and I'll qualify that slightly more later. Revenue performance, I want to show you some data to suggest just how variable it is after mid-May. I think our end management in these higher rainfall zones to meet protein targets is actually a considerable discussion point. And I'd like to introduce you, if you've not already been introduced over the last 3 years to it, that there's a new disease threat on the block. And I'm sure you'll hear more from Grant tomorrow about this, but it's Septoria tritici. In barley, Oxford, south of the Divide in this high rainfall zone, still seems to dominate in terms of being the highest yielder. Behind that, Westminster, slightly later maturity, topping out in 1 or 2 trials. Newcomers to consider, perhaps shorter season, Skipper and Compass. And perhaps if you look at some of the farming group yields, a difference of something like 0.8 to 1 tonne between the highest yielding barleys and the highest yielding wheats in favour of barley. And yield advantage of feed over best malting from 3 years Southern Farming Systems trials, looking at about 8 to 10%. And just a question to raise, is holding back N for malt specification with a malt variety, is it actually economic? Okay, quick fire review. What happened last season? Well, broadly speaking, we had a late break, a lack of opportunity to use knockdown herbicides. Then I think we got a get out of jail free card. We had a warm winter period that enabled a lot of later sown crops to catch up. But still the drier sown crops would have been probably the front runners. Above average rainfall in October. And I think that that too, combined with the fact if you look at the maximum mean temperatures for November, I don't think there was any place on earth colder than southern Victoria. It was 3.5 degrees below the norm back to 2006. On the 11th of November at 12 o'clock, assessing at Westmere, it was 11 degrees. If you want a soft finish, that's a soft finish, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, the new kid on the block, Septoria tritici, and I'm not planning to talk about this in great detail because Grant will tomorrow, but this is our new threat. Basically looks like blackleg on wheat. This disease was conspicuous by its absence, stripe rust. And we saw more take-all in some of our simulated rainfall early break trials than I'd seen for some considerable time. This is the revenue crop, and you'll have seen Anika present this slide this morning to just show you how devastating. And we think that only one spray, which I think was probably the flag spray, has gone missing in the revenue on the right. Okay, let's have a look at some of the wheat performance data from this last season. And I thought we'd try and set it in context with a little survey that we did at the Southern Farming Systems AgriFocus event in October. First question, and James raised it a little this morning, is how many wheat varieties do you need in the portfolio to cope with if it's an early break or a late break? Well, we started by asking what were the most popular varieties being grown on farm, and we asked this of both farmers and advisors, and this is the number of respondents in terms of what varieties were being grown by those that attended. And what you can see is that over 50% of those people attending were growing revenue. Closely behind that, those milling wheats of Bolac and Durham, and to a lesser extent Forest, make up the main body of wheats that were being grown. How many wheats on farm? Any surprises there? I asked the very same question of a group of 80 farmers yesterday in southern New South Wales, and the majority were at 3. Not 2. But the one that really interests me there is that there are a number of people still growing 1. So it'd be interesting to know what that relates to with regards to some of the information we're going to talk about. Okay, this is the MVT early season trial from Teasdale. Now I should point out that all trial sites, irrespective of when they were sown, came up in mid-May. So you can have early season, you can have main season, but at the end of the day, they're going to come up in May. So bear that in mind for a lot of the data from this last year. In terms of what was seen at Teasdale, which was a nice trial site, for those that went along and saw it, and you can see neatly getting up towards 7 tonne with the revenue. Trojan doing a good solid performance in the number 2 position, and then followed by the other 2 feeds, Beauford and Preston. Scout appearing here, Bolac perhaps a little further down in this particular case, and Forest somewhere in the middle. But these 3 pink bars that I've put as feed wheats really showing up consistently in a lot of trials in the high yielding areas of Victoria, with the exception that as you move to the northeast of Victoria, the revenue performance drops back. But in a lot of cases, we're talking of late April sowings in that northeast Victoria area, which is too late, I believe, for something like revenue. It'd need to be sown much earlier. Early season from Streatham, same sort of principles. Trojan dropped a little further back on this one, but Bolac and Forest sitting in behind the soft wheats. But those feeds again showing that advantage, principally Beaufort or revenue. This was the long season trial, but it was actually sown in 28th of April. All I really wanted to show you here was that the revenue advantage is even more pronounced at that particular site. So you've got those differences. They look reasonably typical to what we've seen previously. But what's the typical advantage of those feed wheats over the milling wheats, the AH quality, the H2s. So this time I've just selected out a smaller number of varieties that perhaps represent some of the most popular choices in the region. And broadly speaking, where it says value, it should say 5.4. And we've got, broadly speaking, to Bolac, something like a 13% yield advantage of Beaufort over Bolac. It's not as big an advantage if you go back over this 5-year data set as you see in some of the individual trials, but I'll come on to that. Scout's sitting here at about, well, you've got about 11.5% yield advantage of Beaufort over Scout. Now, I'm talking about these percentages because I think that they could be useful ways in which we look at what premiums we're getting for the different classes of grain and what our markets are. So the next question is that if we're looking at a period 08 to 2012, how does this advantage of feed wheat over milling wheat vary? A bit horrendous, but bear with me on it. What I've done is I've looked at, in this particular case, specific series of sites. It was either at Teasdale or Inverleigh in the years between 2008 and 2013. And the site mean yield, although it's a different value that you see here, I've put on 100%. And what it shows you is the performance then of, firstly on the red line, the Beaufort. So each one of these points is the yield of Beaufort above the site mean for that particular season, for this particular sowing date in that season. And what you can see is that although it moves about a little, the average Beaufort advantage over the Bolac is about 12%. But if you look at the revenue advantage over Bolac, it actually only averages 4%. That's because here in 08, sown on the 22nd of May, it's actually only 110% of the site mean when Bolac's up at 125. Here in 2009, again exactly the same sowing day, it's below the performance of Bolac. We come through to 2011 and it now appears above. So it was higher yielding, revenue was higher yielding than both Beaufort and Bolac. Now I could go into soft finishes, hard finishes, but the point that I'm trying to make is that the advantage of revenue over Bolac really moves around strongly once you get into this second half of May sowing, analysing these trials. So you've got this average advantage in these trials of something like 12, 13%. That gives you some indication of the performance of revenue when it's perhaps sown too late in its window, although some seasons you see that that person who might be growing just one variety might get away with it, and in another season they won't. But I suppose the other interesting thing is how much does that gap between feed and milling move about with different sowing dates. The other point I wanted to make before I show you the effect on the sowing date is that it's all right talking about an advantage of feed over milling, but you still have to achieve the grade with your milling wheat. So in those trials that we've just looked at here, how many times with the management of the trial in those 5 years did Bolac hit 11.5? These are the levels of nitrogen that have been used on the trials over those seasons. But the point I was going to make was that it's not just about a yield advantage of feed over milling, it's about achieving the grade when we actually set ourselves that task. And that's why I believe N management, particularly with regards to getting the right protein specs, if we're paid for them, actually becomes very, very crucial, much more so than in the lower rainfall areas. We sometimes have to look at pushing these wheats to a greater extent in order to get our quality spec. You've already seen this data presented by James and Anika this morning. The reason for showing it to you is that I've talked about a difference between feed and milling of approximately 12 to 13%. And believe it or not, we're not too far off of that 12, 13% between here and these feed points. But if you project that back and you quite rightly say, well, I'd no way I'm going to grow Bolac as early as the 26th of March or the 8th of April, but all I really wanted to show was the fact that that gap is actually large here, here, and here. So in this early April period, perhaps that advantage to feed wheat over milling starts to extend. However, the other thing that really came out of that was the fact that forest, when you did start moving back here, looked to perhaps be better adapted than Bolac, albeit that this is an APW rather than an AH. So, thinking about those differences there that you've got at this stage, even with the premiums on the Bolac, the feed wheats would actually out gross margin at 235 versus 290. So if you've just that yield advantage, although it's at a lower price, you'd still out gross this point here. In the previous examples I've shown you, though, 12 and 13% would easily be taken care of at 5 tonne to 5.6 tonne, say, as the difference between feed and milling. That difference would easily be eroded by the premium on milling wheat. In other words, milling wheat would still win through. In this situation here, at these higher yield levels, it wouldn't. But as I said, you still have to get the quality spec in order to get that price. I'm going to show you some Southern Farming Systems data, which is at a higher yield level, but shows effectively similar principles. You've got 2 sites here, Tarrington and Westmere, and what you clearly see is that the feed wheats have gravitated to the top, revenue strongly better than Beaufort, and Trojan pulling in that second place like we actually saw in an earlier MVT trial, and Bolac then being the best of the AH bracket. There's the average protein. This black line represents 11.5. There's the average protein for those 2 sites. Averages are good because you can disguise a lot of things. If you looked at the individual sites, you'd actually find that one of those sites didn't make spec and the other was well in. The Tarrington site, where 70N was applied, didn't make that spec for the H2s that we would want it to. The one at Westmere did. The other point that probably didn't come up this morning when we were talking about trying to get these wheats into their optimum window was nobody questioned just how well Beaufort did sown March the 26th, April the 8th and April the 24th. Yet its flowering window was way before its optimum. There's some interesting things there. I know we didn't have any frost risk at that site, but just interesting that Beaufort performed so strongly in that time of sowing trial. The conclusions we've already talked about as my take-home messages. But I suppose I wanted to just emphasise about how we can use our data to start looking at how things stack up in our region in terms of the premiums that were being offered for those higher grade specs and whether our yield differences are big enough to justify them. But I think that one of the clear things that shows is that if you were just growing revenue and you had one variety in your portfolio, if you do have a late break, you really are dependent on that soft finish to make the best of that variety choice as the only variety in your portfolio. And there were a number of growers that were just growing revenue. And I think that the other thing that I really want to emphasise from the wheat is this N management around hitting our protein targets in the high rainfall zone. We're not meeting those targets. If these trials are being used as a benchmark, they're not easy for us to always hit. In terms of barley performance, barley yields were exceptionally good through a number of the trials run across southern Victoria. Again, I'd point to the soft finish, and I think in this case we saw some old regulars in terms of diseases in crops, but our impression at Westmere and Inverleigh in particular was that these diseases were very slow to build up until we got to flowering in October. And then from flowering onwards, once the pollen starts to actually coat those leaves, we tended to get more of a disease build-up, which coincided again with that wetter October. I think the thing that stood out for me was that possibly as a result of a late break and cool temperatures, we kept our leaf rust pressure low. Okay, let's go to the Teasdale long-term performance. And this almost starts to take on the look of the wheats in as much as over these last few years the feed barley Oxford has been quite dominant in a number of trials. And you can see that in this particular case. And we get back down to Westminster, which is a popular malting choice but longer season, and then down into the likes of Commander rather. And as you move down, you start picking up some of those other perhaps shorter season barleys. But broadly speaking, this is reasonably flat through here. So you're starting to look at things like malt barleys that keep their head well. So, you know, we know that Gardner barley has a problem with head retention, things like that. We're also mindful that if we can use our short season barleys, we could perhaps sometimes potentially windrow to take ryegrass out of our situation. So it's not necessarily all about the longest season barleys giving us the highest yields. We might actually have some other management options with some of the shorter season malts. That advantage, like I say, with Oxford over the best malts, around that 8 to 10%. It doesn't show in the Southern Farming Systems trials, in the MVT trials, like it does in Southern Farming Systems trials. But if you take 09 to 12 and compare barley yields at the Westmere site with wheat yields, as I was saying, there's an advantage to barley over wheat, which has surprised me, the magnitude of it in a number of the trials. Moving around then for 2013, this is the longer season site at Hamilton, and again I've put the proteins on, and also just showing you again about how Oxford gravitates to the top, Westminster in there. I haven't actually coloured up Fathom as a feed barley, but you can see that Oxford's really been, for a lot of the sites, doing the business over the last few years. In terms of Teasdale, again, it's a long season, but these are all crops that emerged in the third week of May. Here, there was a little bit of a turnaround, and Oxford did not perform so well, and that's something that this site is unusual for, but this was an excellent trial. And Westminster's actually topped out here. Again, like I say, very respectable yields if you compare them to the norm. I think the other thing that comes out here is that the performance of Compass and Skipper has stood out in some of the lower rainfall sites, but also showing up here in a longer season scenario. So Simon will talk to some of that tomorrow. I think one of the things that it leaves me with a conundrum with barley is if you were to pick Westminster, or you were to pick a malt barley that you felt was appropriate for your situation, how much in the high rainfall zone would you hang back on nitrogen? Because I think that there's a number of trials where we're seeing that actually they've been run as if it was a feed barley, but they're still getting us into that malting target and at a higher yield level than we would have obtained by holding back or not putting any nitrogen on, which happens in some commercial situations. So in terms of the barley, Oxford takes some beating in this longer growing season, high rainfall zone. Malts that have been performing strongly, Westminster, Commander. Newcomers with a shorter season aspect to them, Skipper, Compass. I think we should dig around more in this barley versus wheat performance, because I think it's something we grow the barleys in our poor rotation positions, we grow the wheats in our primary rotation positions. Just what will barley do for us post canola, say? Feed advantage over the best malts around 8 to 10, and that's looking at Southern Farming Systems data for the 3 years up to 2012. And just something I think to stimulate discussion: how much should we hold back in the high rainfall zone with nitrogen on malting barleys such as Westminster, for instance? In putting the talk together, I'd really like to thank my colleague Simon Craig. We bounce a few things off of one another, and it's been great to have that. Also, we're very new into this project, so I apologise in advance for misrepresenting, if I have done in any way, the MVT, but Alan and Neil have been superb in helping us through. And lastly, the Southern Farming Systems team. So, thank you.